Hey guys, tonight we dive into one of the most extraordinary lives ever lived. A man who painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel while lying on his back for 4 years. Who carved figures so lifelike, people swore they could see veins pulse beneath the marble. Who survived popes, plagues, and his own relentless punishing genius, and somehow kept working well into his 90s. Tonight, we are talking about Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni, the man, the myth, the artist who made the Renaissance look like it was trying to keep up with him. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because this story doesn't start in a grand palace or a glittering studio. It starts in a farmhouse in the Tuscan hills, with a baby nobody expected to matter, and it ends nearly 90 years later, with a half-finished sculpture still gripped in the hands of the greatest artist who ever lived. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Was Given to the Stone. You are born on the 6th of March, 1475, in a small hilltop town called Caprese in the Tuscan countryside. Your father, Lodovico di Leonardo Buonarroti Simoni, is a minor government official, which sounds impressive until you realise he's the podestar of Caprese, a glorified administrator for a tiny village perched in the cold Apennine Hills. He's proud of his family name, proud of the Buonarroti lineage, which he insists stretches back to Florentine nobility, though the evidence for this is roughly as solid as unset plaster. He's not a man who likes to work with his hands. He considers it beneath him. This detail will matter enormously when his second son starts showing an embarrassing talent for exactly that. Your mother is Francesca Di Neri. She's 20 years old when you arrive, her second child, and already exhausted by the demands of motherhood, in a cold stone house with drafty corridors and the smell of wood smoke permanently baked into everything. She does not survive your childhood. She falls ill when you're still very small, and by the time you're 6 years old, she is gone. You will barely remember her face, but you will spend the rest of your life carving the Madonna, the Mother of God, over and over and over again, in marble, in paint, in chalk, in bronze. Psychologists could fill libraries with the implications of that. Because your mother is too ill to nurse you, you are sent to live with a wet nurse in the village of Settignano, just outside Florence. This is not unusual for the time. What is unusual is where the nurse lives. Settignano is a town of stonecutters. Her husband is a stonecutter. Her father was a stonecutter. The hills around Settignano are honeycombed with quarries, and the sound of chisel on stone is as normal there as birdsong. You grow up surrounded by the smell of cut rock, the fine white dust that hangs in the air like fog, the rhythmic tapping and scraping of men pulling shapes out of the earth. Before you can read, before you can write, before you understand anything about art or beauty or genius, your hands already know the language of stone. Michelangelo will later say, with the sort of effortless mysticism that drove his biographers absolutely mad, that he absorbed the love of hammer and chisel with his nurse's milk. It's a romantic line. It's also, in the deepest possible sense, true. When you are roughly 7 or 8, your father moves the family to Florence, the most intellectually alive city on earth at that particular moment in history. The Medici are in power. Lorenzo de' Medici, who will one day become your patron and change everything, is already consolidating his grip on the city. Poets, philosophers, architects, and painters fill the streets. The air smells of linseed oil and ambition. You, a skinny boy from the hills with stone dust in your fingernails, are going to fit right in. Eventually. But not before your father tries very hard to make sure you don't. Lodovico sends you to school, grammar, Latin, the respectable curriculum of a boy who is supposed to grow up and become something useful, something that doesn't involve getting your hands dirty. You go. You sit in the classroom, you stare out the window, you draw, on every scrap of paper you can find, on the margins of your schoolwork, on the walls of buildings when you think no one is watching. You're not a bad student. You're simply a student who has absolutely no intention of becoming what school is trying to make him. Your only real friend in those early years is Francesco Granacci, a boy a few years older than you who is already apprenticed to the painter. Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of the most successful workshop painters in Florence. Granacci keeps smuggling drawings out of Ghirlandaio's workshop for you to copy. You sit up late into the night, by the light of a candle your father would disapprove of using for this purpose, copying the poses and compositions of great paintings, not tracing. Copying from memory and observation, building the visual vocabulary that will eventually produce the Sistine Chapel. Your father is not pleased with any of this. Lodovico is a man who has constructed a careful identity around the idea of the Buonarroti family's gentility. Painters in 15th century Florence are craftsmen. They belong to guilds. They work with their hands. They are, in the social taxonomy of the day, decidedly not gentlemen. Every time you pick up a piece of chalk, your father sees the family name sliding a little further down the social scale. He has beaten you for it more than once, not cruelly, not with the intent of a tyrant, but with the blunt frustration of a man who cannot understand why his son won't simply be reasonable. You absorb the beatings the same way you absorb everything. You keep drawing. The schoolmaster writes notes home. Your father burns them in the fireplace, which tells you more about your father's relationship with reality than perhaps he intends. Florence in the 1480s is a city in the middle of becoming something the world has never quite seen before. You have to understand what this means. It is not like visiting a modern museum and seeing beautiful old things behind glass. Florence is the museum and the street and the argument all at once. On your walk to school, you pass the baptistery with its bronze doors by Ghiberti, doors so perfect that people have been calling them the gates of paradise for 40 years. You pass the cathedral with Brunelleschi's dome rising above it like a miracle of mathematics and stubbornness. You pass the churches that contain Giotto's frescoes and Masaccio's frescoes, the painted tradition you are about to transform beyond recognition. You live inside the greatest concentration of human creative achievement in the history of Europe since ancient Athens, and you are 12 years old, and you cannot think about anything except the shapes of the things you see, and how you might render them on paper with enough truth to make them live. The city is also, of course, a place of politics and plague and poverty. There are no floods periodically. The guilds govern everything. The Medici govern the guilds. Underneath the gorgeous surface, Florence is a place of fierce factionalism, sudden violence, and the ever-present threat that the delicate balance of power that makes the city's cultural flowering possible might tip over at any moment. This tension, this beauty maintained against the constant pressure of its own instability, is something you absorb as naturally as the stone dust from Settignano. It comes out later, in marble, in figures that are always on the verge of movement or collapse, in the enormous controlled tension of bodies that want to explode outward, but are held by the stone itself in permanent stillness. Eventually, with Granacci's help, you wear him down. In 1488, when you are 13 years old, Lodovico Buonarroti does the thing he has been resisting for years. He signs the papers. He apprentices his son to the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, and from the moment you walk through that door, nothing is ever the same again. Chapter 2. The Workshop and the Garden of Giants. Ghirlandaio's workshop is the kind of place where you learn very quickly whether you actually have what people say you have, or whether you are just the most talented kid in a town of stonecutters. The answer in your case is revealed embarrassingly fast. You're better than the other apprentices within weeks, better than some of the journeymen within months. Ghirlandaio, who is a talented and successful painter but not quite an immortal genius, recognizes what he's looking at and has the grace not to pretend otherwise. The workshop is run like a factory because that's essentially what it is. Wealthy patrons commission frescoes for churches, altarpieces for chapels, portraits for their private studies. Ghirlandaio and his team produce them on schedule, with professional efficiency, beautiful and competent and occasionally transcendent. You are supposed to be learning to grind pigments, to prepare gesso, to assist with the lower sections of frescoes, to do the unglamorous work that apprentices do. Instead, you keep correcting the master's drawings. Not out of arrogance, not exactly. More the way a person with perfect pitch can't help wincing at a flat note. You simply see it, and you can't stop yourself from fixing it. There are stories, probably embellished, that Ghirlandaio once found you correcting one of his own sketches and stared at it for a long moment before walking away without saying anything. This is the most plausible kind of story. What else do you say to a 13-year-old who is already better than you? The contract Ghirlandaio signed with your father was supposed to last 3 years. You leave after 1. In some versions of this story, Ghirlandaio himself recommends you to the Medici. In other versions, you simply present yourself. Both feel true to the kind of person you already are at 14. Someone for whom the next larger challenge is always more compelling than the task at hand, and who has the rare combination of gifts and confidence to pursue it without asking anyone's permission. The door that opens next is one of the strangest and most remarkable opportunities in the history of art. Lorenzo de' Medici, ruler of Florence, patron of nearly every significant cultural project in the city, has established something in the gardens of the monastery of San Marco. It is not quite a school, not quite a museum. It is more like a place where gifted young artists can study an extraordinary collection of ancient Greek and Roman sculpture that Lorenzo has assembled under the loose supervision of the sculptor Bertoldo di Giovanni, one of Donatello's former students. Ghirlandaio, almost certainly at your request and with your father's reluctant consent, sends you to the garden. You are 14 years old. You are about to walk into the company of gods. The Medici garden is a strange, dreamy place. Ancient marble figures stand in the afternoon light, missing arms and noses, worn smooth by centuries, but still crackling with life. Satyrs and athletes and gods and emperors. You walk among them, like a man sleepwalking through a dream he's already seen. You study them obsessively. You run your hands over the stone to understand how the original sculptors had pulled these figures free from raw marble, how they had captured the moment just before movement, the tension of a coiled spring, the weight of grief, the exhilaration of flight. The key insight you are developing, running your fingers over ancient stone in a Florentine garden, is one of the central mysteries of all sculpture. The figure is not added to the marble, it is already in there. The sculptor's task is to remove everything that is not the figure. This is not just a poetic notion, it is a practical working philosophy that changes how you approach every block of stone you will ever touch. You do not build up, you reveal. You are, in the deepest sense, an archaeologist of forms that exist before you touch them. Bertoldo is an old man by this point, and not in the best health. He teaches you what he can, but the real education is the stones themselves. And it is in this garden that you carve what is probably your first surviving work, a marble relief called the Battle of the Centaurs. You are 15. You are barely shaving. The Battle of the Centaurs is a writhing, chaotic tangle of bodies, human and half-human, twisted and grasping and reaching. It is compositionally sophisticated, physically dynamic, emotionally overwhelming. It is not a student work. It is the work of a sculptor who has somehow already absorbed 3 generations of knowledge and synthesized it into something entirely his own. Lorenzo de' Medici notices you, and this is not a small thing. Lorenzo is one of the most powerful men in Italy. He is a poet, a philosopher, a political genius, and a man with a genuine eye for art. His court contains, at various moments, Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Poliziano, Pico della Mirandola. He has a gift for recognizing extraordinary minds and an instinct for attaching his name to them. When Lorenzo notices you, he invites you to live in the Medici Palace. You are 15 years old. You move in. Life at the Medici Palace is like being transported to another dimension. You eat at the family table alongside Lorenzo's children, his scholars, his poets. You have new clothes, proper clothes, not the rough apprentice garb you've worn your whole life. You have a room of your own. You have access to the library, one of the finest in Europe. You have the daily company of some of the most brilliant minds of the century. The philosopher Marsilio Ficino holds forth at dinner about Plato. The poet Poliziano recites verses that he's composed that afternoon. Lorenzo himself talks about politics, philosophy, art, with a casual brilliance that makes the air feel charged, and then passes the wine and laughs at something the musician has just played. Lorenzo gives you a stipend, 5 ducats a month, which is nothing lavish, but is enough. More importantly, he gives you his support, his name, his protection. In Renaissance Florence, these things are worth more than money. He also gives you something your own father never quite managed. He looks at what you are and seems genuinely glad that you exist. You spend 2 years in the Medici Palace. You carve, you study, you argue with philosophers, you read Dante. You become not just a craftsman, but a thinker, a man whose art will always be saturated with theological and philosophical ideas that would have been inaccessible to any other sculptor of his age. The Medici give you the vocabulary to understand what you are already making. There is also, during these years, an incident that is almost certainly true because it is too specific and too embarrassing to be invented. You make a fawn's head, one of those grinning, goat-eared faces from classical mythology. Lorenzo sees it and praises it, then points out that old fawns, in his experience, don't have all their teeth. So you pick up a chisel and knock out one of the teeth, then press the stone to give the impression of a bleeding gum. Lorenzo laughs. He is delighted. He goes to tell your father that you must come and live in the palace. The detail of the bleeding gum, so specific, so immediately physical, is a perfect small portrait of the kind of artist you already are. Someone who is not interested in the idea of a thing, but in the thing itself, in the actual experience of being ancient and missing a tooth, and having the absence be real enough to notice. Your father is offered a minor government position as part of the arrangement. He accepts. He remains conflicted about his son's profession for the rest of his life, but he is practical enough to accept a government job when one is offered. This is perhaps the most human thing about Lodovico Buonarroti. He is a man whose principles are just slightly less firm than his financial interests, which makes him, in this way, very much a man of his time. And then, in April 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici dies. He is only 43 years old. The official cause is gout and fever, though there are darker whispers about the family physicians and a mineral treatment gone catastrophically wrong. You are 17. You're not present at the death, but you feel it as though a wall has collapsed. Florence feels immediately smaller, colder, less safe. Within 2 years, the Medici will be expelled from Florence altogether. The Golden Age, that brief, glorious, unlikely moment when one city somehow became the centre of the Western world, is over. You are on your own. Chapter 3. Bologna, Rome and the Sleeping God. After Lorenzo's death, you remain in Florence for a short while under the patronage of his son Piero de' Medici, who is unfortunately the family's spectacular overachiever in reverse. Where Lorenzo was brilliant, politically gifted, and surrounded by genius, Piero is arrogant, obtuse, and possessed of the peculiar kind of self-confidence that has no relationship whatsoever to actual ability. He is the sort of man who commissions a great artist to carve a statue out of snow, and indeed, when a particularly impressive snowstorm hits Florence in the winter of 1494, this is exactly what Piero does. He summons you. You carve a snow statue. It melts. This is more or less a metaphor for the entire Piero de' Medici era. You leave Florence before it fully falls apart. In October 1494, the French army of Charles VIII pours over the Alps and heads toward the city. Piero, in a display of diplomatic cowardice so spectacular it will be discussed by historians for centuries, rides out to meet the French king and surrenders nearly everything before a single soldier sets foot inside Florence's walls. The Florentines, infuriated, promptly rise up and expel the Medici. You're 19 years old and out of a patron. You spend time in Venice briefly, then make your way to Bologna, where you live for just over a year in the household of a nobleman named Gianfrancesco Aldovrandi. This is a gentler period, a breathing space. You make friends. You study the sculptures of Jacopo della Quercia on the church of San Petronio, and they sink into you the way everything sinks into you permanently, shaping the architectural gravity and monumental power that will define your later work. You also, in an arrangement that says a great deal about Renaissance artistic culture, carve 3 small marble figures for the tomb of Saint Dominic, completing work left unfinished by earlier sculptors. Small figures, just 3, but they are perfectly realized, each one a complete world in miniature. You return to Florence in 1495 and you are 20 years old, which means you are technically an adult, practically still a teenager, and already one of the better sculptors in Italy. The city is now in the grip of the terrifying and charismatic friar Girolamo Savonarola, whose bonfires of the vanities are consuming paintings, mirrors, books, playing cards, and anything else that can be accused of distracting the faithful from God. It is not, one might say, the most hospitable environment for an artist. You carve a sleeping Cupid. It is so good, so authentically classical in its sensibility, that your dealer suggests burying it briefly in soil to give it the convincing patina of an ancient Roman artifact. You agree. The Cupid is sold to Cardinal Raffaele Riario in Rome as a genuine antique for 200 ducats. When Riario eventually discovers the deception, he is more impressed than angry. He wants to meet the man who made something good enough to fool him. You arrive in Rome for the first time in June 1496. You are 21 years old. Rome in 1496 is not the eternal, magnificent, tourist-filled city you might picture. It is, by the standards of the Renaissance, a shambles. The papacy has spent much of the previous century in Avignon or fighting itself, and the city shows the neglect. Ruins everywhere, ancient and medieval alike. Cattle grazing in the Forum. Vast empty spaces where ancient buildings once stood. The population is a fraction of what it was in the classical era, and yet there is something in the air here that is different from Florence. A bigger scale, a grander ambition. The ruins themselves are a kind of instruction manual in the sublime. evidence of a civilization that built at a scale modern people can barely imagine and had mostly lost the ability to match. You love it immediately. You spend your first weeks walking the ruins before you begin working. The Colosseum, the Pantheon, still intact, its dome an engineering mystery that even 2,000 years later nobody has fully decoded. The ancient sculpture that fills private collections and public spaces. The Laocoon group is not yet unearthed. That is still a decade away. But the Apollo Belvedere is in Rome, and you go to see it, and it confirms what you already believed, that the ancient world understood the human body at a level no living artist has yet matched. That the goal is not to imitate the ancients, but to understand what they understood, and then to go further. Cardinal Riario commissions you to carve a life-sized Bacchus, the Roman god of wine. The finished work is one of the strangest and most psychologically complex sculptures of the Renaissance. Bacchus stands slightly off balance, one knee slightly bent, head tipped back, mouth slightly open, a cup of wine raised in his hand as though he's already forgotten what he was about to do with it. His eyes are blank. His expression is not the triumphant glee of the god of wine in full power, but the vacant, slightly nauseated look of someone who has had considerably too much of the thing he's supposed to represent. Beside him, a satyr is eating grapes from the bunch draped over Bacchus's arm, and grinning with the private satisfaction of someone who knows they've gotten away with something. It is a masterpiece. Riario decides he doesn't want it. This is fine. You are not worried. Because something else has appeared. A commission that will make everything, before it look like a warm-up. Cardinal Jean de Billère de la Grolas, a French ambassador to the Vatican, wants a marble group for his tomb chapel in St. Peter's Basilica. He wants the Virgin Mary holding the body of Christ, freshly taken down from the cross. The Pietà. It is a subject painted and sculpted many times, but always with the same problem. The proportions are wrong. A grown man's body laid across a woman's lap is awkward. The anatomy fights the tenderness. No one has quite solved it. You are 23 years old. You solve it. You do it by making the Virgin Mary enormous. Not unrealistically so. Not so that you'd notice if you weren't thinking about it, but just enough that Christ's body fits naturally, draped across her knees with a terrible, beautiful gravity. Her face is young, impossibly young for the mother of a 33-year-old man, and you are asked about this and give an answer that is either theology or poetry or both. Virginal women, you say, are preserved by God from the ravages of age. This is not an anatomical argument. It is a spiritual one. She looks like a girl holding her child, and the dissonance of a mother younger looking than her son somehow makes the grief more unbearable, not less. The drapery is carved with a precision that makes experts in the 21st century stare at photographs, wondering how marble was persuaded to behave like cloth. The folds are deep and crisp. The fabric moves. Christ's body has the right weight, the right limpness, the right relationship between bone and flesh that a sculptor achieves only by knowing anatomy from the inside. You have been studying cadavers at the hospital of Santo Spirito with the reluctant permission of the prior, dissecting bodies to understand what lies beneath the skin. The knowledge shows. Every tendon, every rib, every relaxed muscle speaks of a man who understood human bodies not as visual patterns but as engineering. When the Pietà is unveiled, people gather around it. They whisper. They come back the next day and look again. They debate how it was done, who could have done it, and a rumour circulates that the work is actually by a more established Milanese sculptor named Cristoforo Solari. You go back to the church at night, you bring a chisel, and across the strap crossing Mary's chest, you carve your name: Michael, Angelus, Buonarroti, Florent, Faciabat. It is the only work you will ever sign, and you will claim later that you did it in a fit of rage that you immediately regretted. The regret is believable. The rage is completely understandable. When the pietà is unveiled, people gather around it. They whisper. They come back the next day and look again. They debate how it was done, who could have done it, and a rumour circulates that the work is actually by a more established Milanese sculptor named Cristoforo Solari. You go back to the church at night. You bring a chisel, and across the strap crossing Mary's chest you carve your name, Michael Angelus Buonarroti Florent Facibat. It is the only work you will ever sign, and you will claim later that you did it in a fit of rage that you immediately regretted. The regret is believable. The rage is completely understandable. You are 25 years old. You have just made the most beautiful marble sculpture in the world, and you wanted people to know it was yours. The Pietà has now stood in St. Peter's for over 500 years. In 1972, a geologist with a documented history of mental illness walked into the basilica, took out a hammer, and struck the work 15 times before he was restrained. He damaged the Virgin's arm, nose, and eyelid. The repairs took 10 months and were done in excruciating detail by teams of conservators working with fragments of marble collected from the chapel floor. The work was then placed behind bulletproof glass, where it remains. 5 centuries of popes, wars, plagues, and social upheaval, 15 blows of a hammer, and still there. Some things, it turns out, are harder to destroy than the people who try to destroy them. Chapter 4. The Giant Sleeping in the Marble. You return to Florence in 1501. The city has changed. Savonarola is dead, burned at the stake in the very square where he once burned paintings, which is a kind of historical justice that even the most dispassionate observer has to appreciate. The Republic is functioning shakily under the uncertain governance of Piero Soderini. The Medici are still in exile, and sitting in the workshop of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, abandoned and half forgotten for more than 30 years, is an enormous block of marble. The block is roughly 18 feet tall. It was quarried in 1464 from the famous marble pits at Carrara, commissioned by the Opera del Duomo, the board that oversees the cathedral, with the idea of creating a monumental figure for one of the cathedral's buttresses. 2 sculptors had attempted it and abandoned it. One of them, Agostino di Duccio, had already roughed out some initial cuts before giving up, which means the block is not a pristine challenge. It is a compromised one, irregular in certain ways, narrow in ways that will constrain whatever figure eventually emerges from it. The cathedral board, casting around for someone who might finally do something with their enormous, expensive, neglected block of marble, approaches you. You walk around it for a long time. You look at it. You think. You say you'll do it. The contract is signed in August 1501. The subject will be David, the biblical shepherd boy who defeated the giant Goliath. The most common visual interpretation of David at this moment in art history shows him, after the battle, the giant's head at his feet, the victory achieved. You don't do this. You are going to show him before. The moment of decision. The moment between looking at the enemy and beginning to move toward him. You work on the David for 2 years and 2 months, mostly alone, with the block surrounded by a wooden screen so that visitors to the cathedral workshop cannot see what you're doing. You work in near secrecy, sleeping at the site some nights, eating irregularly, barely washing, driving your assistants to quiet desperation with your demands and your silences, and your habit of staring at a particular area of the stone for what might be half an hour before making a single careful cut. The emerging figure is 17 feet tall. He is not the boy in Donatello's earlier David. Small, slight, dressed in a shepherd's hat, with the giant's head already defeated at his feet. This David is a man, or just on the verge of manhood, and his proportions are deliberately altered to take into account the fact that he was originally intended to be viewed from far below on a cathedral buttress. The head and hands are slightly larger than strict anatomy would dictate. The veins on the right hand are pronounced and real. The sinews of the neck are taut. The expression on the face is the expression of someone who has made a decision he cannot unmake, who is fully aware of the danger ahead and is going forward anyway. The sling is draped over his left shoulder, almost casual. The right hand hangs at his side, the stone ready. His gaze turns to the left, toward the unseen enemy. Everything in him is poised. Nothing in him is at rest. There is a detail that visitors to the academia sometimes notice and sometimes miss. If you look at David's right hand, the one hanging at his side, the tendons and veins are pronounced in a way that goes slightly beyond what ordinary anatomy would suggest. The hand is tighter than relaxed. It is the hand of someone who is gripping nothing and controlling everything, who is holding his own resolve in check until the moment to release it. Michelangelo has carved in a marble hand the physical sensation of deciding to do something you're terrified to do. This is what separates the David from every other large sculpture of the Renaissance. The other masterpieces of the period are beautiful. The David is alive in a different way, psychologically, not just physically. It contains a person, not just a form. When the David is completed in early 1504, the question of where to put it becomes a matter of urgent civic debate. A committee of 30 leading Florentine citizens, including Leonardo da Vinci and Sandro Botticelli, is convened to decide. This is remarkable and somewhat amusing. The greatest artists in Italy gathered in a room together to discuss the parking situation for a statue. Leonardo, who had no particular warmth for you and would develop an active dislike over the next few years, suggests a location that would put the statue in the shade, where its imperfections would be less visible. You notice this. You remember it. The committee eventually decides on the Piazza della Signoria, the main civic square in Florence, in front of the government palace, not on a cathedral buttress, not in a church, in the open air of the public square where everyone can see it, where it will stand as a symbol not of religious triumph but of civic courage. Moving the statue from the workshop to the piazza takes 4 days. It is moved on a specially constructed sledge, rolled on greased wooden beams by 40 men working in shifts. A mob attacks it on the first night with stones, apparently furious about something. Nobody is quite sure what. The statue survives. On the 8th of September, 1504, the David is unveiled in the Piazza della Signoria. Florence stops. The city simply stops and looks at it. There has never been anything like it, not since the ancient world. A marble figure of this size and this quality, this psychologically complex, this physically perfect, this charged with meaning and intention and life. People stand in the square and cannot quite explain what they feel. The theologians find biblical allegory. The politicians find civic symbolism. The artists find technical mastery so complete it is almost cruel. The ordinary Florentines, the merchants and the wool workers and the market vendors find something they perhaps cannot name but recognize immediately. They find a human being, whole and real and frightened and brave. It will stand in that square for almost 4 centuries, until 1873, when it is moved indoors to protect it from the weather. A replica stands in the piazza today. The original is in the Accademia in Florence, in a room built specifically for it, where 5 million people a year make a pilgrimage to stand in front of it and feel whatever it is that human beings feel when they are in the presence of something that confirms their best suspicions about what the species is capable of. You are 29 years old when the David is unveiled, and you have barely started. There is one more thing that happens in Florence in the years around the David that deserves mention, because it is one of the great what-ifs of the Renaissance. In 1503, both you and Leonardo da Vinci are commissioned to paint competing frescoes in the Great Hall of the Palazzo della Signoria. Leonardo is to paint the Battle of Anghiari. You are to paint the Battle of Cassina. These two works, side by side on opposing walls, would have been the defining confrontation of the Renaissance, the two greatest minds of the age going head-to-head in the same room on the same scale. The dynamic between you and Leonardo is one of the more interesting undercurrents of the period. Leonardo is 23 years older than you, already famous, already surrounded by the mythology of genius. He is tall, physically beautiful by all accounts, impeccably dressed, a man who moves through the world with the studied ease of someone who has decided to be mysterious and found that it works. He is also a painter who, in your view, has never quite finished anything important. The Last Supper is painted in an experimental medium that is already flaking from the wall. The Adoration of the Magi is abandoned. The notebooks full of extraordinary ideas have produced remarkably few realized objects. You find this incomprehensible. You are a man who finishes things, or at least who suffers enormously when he doesn't. The idea of a genius who is content to leave his greatest ideas as ideas strikes you as a kind of crime. Leonardo, for his part, finds your obsession with the male body suspect, your manner aggressive, and your single-minded focus on sculpture a symptom of limited imagination. He says, on one occasion, in the hearing of people who write it down, that painting is superior to sculpture because sculpture is merely the art of subtracting what is not needed, whereas painting creates from nothing. You hear about this remark. You do not forget it. Neither fresco is ever completed. Leonardo experiments with his plaster technique, and it fails catastrophically. You are summoned to Rome by Julius before you can finish more than the cartoon, the full-scale preparatory drawing. The Battle of Cassina cartoon survives for a few decades, is copied, admired, and torn apart by other artists, seeking to learn from it, and then it is lost. The only records are the copies, and from those copies it is clear that the composition was extraordinary, a scene not of battle itself, but of soldiers being surprised while bathing, caught mid-movement, scrambling for their armour, bodies twisting in 100 different directions against the urgency of the moment. What was lost when that cartoon disappeared is incalculable, and what was never made at all, those two walls, that impossible competition, is one of the most painful absences in the history of art. Chapter 5. The Pope, the Ceiling, and 4 Years of Hell. You return to Rome in 1505. Pope Julius II has summoned you. Julius II is one of the most extraordinary figures of the Renaissance papacy, which is a category that does not suffer from a shortage of extraordinary figures. He is a warrior pope, a man who leads armies personally and rides into battle in full armour at an age when most people are quietly waiting to die. He has enormous ambition for the papacy as a temporal and cultural power, and he has developed the characteristic of great patrons throughout history, which is the unshakable conviction that the things he wants done should be done immediately, regardless of what is physically possible. His nickname, Il Papa Terribile, the Terrible Pope, is not given in condemnation. It is given in the same spirit as you will later be called Il Divino. It means the awe-inspiring Pope, the Pope who is simply too much, too loud, too real for ordinary categories to contain. You two understand each other in the way that only people with enormous egos and genuine gifts can understand each other, which is to say imperfectly, furiously, and with a deep, if seldom expressed, mutual respect. Julius needs you because nobody else can deliver what he wants, You need Julius because nobody else is willing to pay for what you want to make. It is the most productive relationship of mutual exploitation in the history of Western art. He wants a tomb, not a small commemorative monument, not a simple sarcophagus. He wants the most magnificent papal tomb ever constructed, a freestanding, multi-tiered marble mountain of approximately 40 life-sized figures, to be housed in a new, vastly enlarged St. Peter's Basilica, which he also intends to build. The scale is staggering. You spend weeks planning it, drawing and dreaming and calculating. You go to Carrara and spend 8 months personally selecting the marble, which you then arrange to be shipped to Rome at considerable expense. You set up a workshop. You prepare to begin what will be the defining project of your life, and then Julius loses interest. This is not a metaphor. The Pope literally stops returning your requests for audiences. You wait in his antechambers for days at a stretch, and a groom eventually tells you the Pope doesn't want to see you anymore. You go back to your workshop furious. You borrow money from a friend for the journey. Leave a message saying that if the Pope wants you, he can look for you, and ride back to Florence in a state of cold fury that is, if anything, a more controlled and dangerous emotion than ordinary rage. Julius sends 5 couriers after you over the following months, each time escalating the urgency, each time you decline to return. This goes on for approximately 7 months, during which you are also dealing with a threat from Julius to invade Florence if they don't send you back, which Florence declines to quite believe, and you take approximately as seriously as you take everything coming from Rome, which is to say, with one eye open and one hand near your tools, you eventually return. Julius immediately proposes an entirely different project. He wants you to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. You refuse, multiple times. You are a sculptor, you say. You have no experience with large-scale fresco painting. The Sistine Chapel already has a perfectly adequate, painted ceiling, a blue field dotted with gold stars, commissioned by Pope Sixtus IV decades earlier. It doesn't need to be repainted, and you're supposed to be carving the tomb. The ceiling is a distraction, a massive, technically ruinous distraction. Julius insists. You agree. Because you are, in the end, not a man who can look at a large, empty surface and simply walk away from it. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is approximately 5,800 square feet of curved surface, 40 feet above the floor of the chapel, requiring scaffolding that spans the entire width of the building. The original plan, presumably proposed by Julius or his advisors, is relatively modest. The 12 apostles, arranged in the pendentives above the windows, with some decorative work in the remaining spaces. You look at this plan and decide it is completely inadequate. You propose something different, something vastly larger in scope, more theologically ambitious, more compositionally complex. You propose the entire history of creation, from the void before light to the drunkenness of Noah after the flood, with the prophets and sibyls arranged around the edges, the ancestors of Christ in the triangular sections, 9 narrative scenes from Genesis running down the centre, and everywhere, filling every lunette and corner and niche, figures, hundreds of figures. Julius agrees. He may not have fully understood what he was agreeing to. The painting begins in 1508. You hire assistants, fire most of them within weeks, accuse them variously of incompetence and artistic cowardice, and end up doing the vast majority of the work yourself. Fresco is an unforgiving medium. You paint onto wet plaster, and whatever you paint must be finished while the plaster is still wet, usually within a few hours, because once it dries, the fresco is fixed. Any changes must be done by chipping out the dried plaster and relaying it fresh. You work in sections called giornate, a day's work, planning carefully which areas can be completed in a single session and which require new plaster. The physical conditions defy belief. The The scaffolding is an engineering project in itself, designed not by leaning ladders against the walls, but by a cantilevered wooden platform that spans the full width of the chapel, attached to the walls and rising to within a few feet of the curved ceiling surface. The chapel continues to function below while you work. Above it, which means that Mass is said, diplomatic meetings are held, cardinals process in and out, all while you and your assistants labour in the dusty, candlelit space overhead. You sometimes hear the sound of choir music rising up through the boards. You sometimes hear nothing at all except your own breathing and the soft scratch of the brush. The physical conditions are extraordinary. You paint standing and seated on the scaffolding, bent backward, arms raised above your head for hours at a stretch. You develop a spinal condition. Your neck becomes locked in certain positions. Your vision deteriorates, possibly from the paint dripping into his eyes, so badly that he has to hold letters above his head to read them for a period after the ceiling is finished. He writes a poem during this period, accompanied by a self-portrait sketch showing himself bent backward with his arm raised, tongue out, eyes rolling upward. The poem describes how his beard points to the sky, his chest is like a harpy's, his brush constantly drips onto his face, and the floor of his mind has become his ceiling. It is the poem of a man who is suffering enormously and is furious about it, but is also, somewhere underneath the suffering, unable to stop. Julius comes to the chapel repeatedly to check progress. He comes with opinions, he comes with suggestions, he comes with impatience. When you lock the chapel doors, he occasionally shows up with a ladder and climbs up to look for himself. He asks repeatedly when it will be done. You develop stock answers to this question. It will be done when it is done, soon, when I am satisfied. These are not the answers Julius wants, and eventually he threatens to throw you off the scaffolding, which you may or may not take literally, but which does have the effect of motivating a slightly faster pace. There is a period, around 1510, when Julius is away from Rome on his military campaigns, that you have a few months of relatively uninterrupted work. These are perhaps the most productive weeks of your life. You develop a speed and a confidence in the fresco technique that is visible in the work. The earlier sections of the ceiling are careful, somewhat tentative, slightly more conservative in their compositions. The later sections, the ones you paint after you have 2 years of practice on this extraordinary surface, are bolder, larger figures, more dramatic foreshortening. The bodies in the later prophets and sibyls are immense muscular presences that fill their niches like barely contained forces of nature. The Sistine ceiling is a record of an artist teaching himself, at full scale, in the most public possible venue, and accelerating as he goes. You paint 9 central scenes across the vault, the separation of light from darkness, the creation of sun, moon, and plants, the separation of land and sea, the creation of Adam, the creation of Eve, the temptation and expulsion, the sacrifice of Noah, the great flood, the drunkenness of Noah. The sequence runs from the altar end of the chapel toward the entrance, but you paint it the other way, starting from Noah and working toward God. This means your technique and ambition grow as you go, and the figures in the second half of the ceiling, particularly around the creation of Adam, are larger, more powerful, more confident than anything in the first sections. You can watch him teach himself to paint on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, accelerating with every panel. The creation of Adam is the most reproduced religious painting in the history of art. You know the image. God in a swirling cloak, his arm outstretched, his finger reaching toward the languid, not quite awake figure of the first man. Adam reclines against the earth, his own arm reaching back, that tiny space between the 2 fingertips that contains everything, creation and distance, and the moment just before contact. God is surrounded by angels and by a draped female figure whose identity has been debated for 5 centuries. She might be Eve, waiting to be created. She might be the embodiment of divine wisdom. Whatever she is watching. The spark that passes in that gap between fingers is not lightning. It is something more disturbing and more tender than that. It is the look of recognition, the creator seeing himself reflected in what he has made. In October 1512, after 4 years of work, you unveil the ceiling. Julius cries. Accounts vary on whether this is credible for a man who rode into battle without visible emotion, but the story persists. The ceiling is undeniably overwhelming. Visitors to the chapel stand on the floor and crane their necks backward and try to take in a visual world of such density and ambition and sheer beauty that comprehension comes in waves rather than all at once. The figures in the pendentives, the prophets and sibyls, are 9 to 10 feet tall. The central narrative scenes are framed with a painted marble architecture that creates the illusion of a structure built above the actual structure, of a ceiling above the ceiling. The colours, which were obscured for centuries by candle smoke and later cleaned in a controversial restoration in the 1980s, are shocking in their brightness. Pink and orange and acid green and turquoise and gold. It is not a religious painting so much as a religious universe, a complete theology made visible. Julius dies 4 months later. The tomb, the original project, the enormous marble monument that started all of this, is still unfinished. It will remain a source of anguish for the next 40 years of your life, endlessly revised, downsized, renegotiated with Julius's heirs until the final, much reduced version is installed in 1545. You call it the tragedy of the tomb. It is the one promise you make to yourself that you cannot quite keep. Chapter 6. Between Popes and Wars. The years following the Sistine ceiling are not years of rest. Michelangelo does not rest. He does not know how. He makes plans. He argues. He works. He suffers the particular frustration of a man whose creative ambitions are always outrunning his available time, available resources, available peace. You spend long stretches in Florence during this period, working on a series of ambitious projects for the Medici family who have returned to the city. Pope Leo X, who is a Medici himself, born Giovanni de' Medici, Lorenzo's second son, wants a grand facade for the Basilica of San Lorenzo in Florence, the Medici family's parish church and de facto monument. You spend 3 years designing it, selecting marble, negotiating contracts, building roads in the mountains of Carrara and Pietrasanta specifically to allow the marble to be transported. The road building alone is an engineering achievement. In 1520, the contract is cancelled. The facade is never built. San Lorenzo stands to this day with its plain brick face, a testament to how frequently the grandest plans dissolve in the gap between ambition and execution. But while the facade falls apart, something else is authorized. The Medici want a new sacristy for San Lorenzo to house the tombs of family members, and they want it designed and executed by you. The new sacristy, as it becomes known, is the first work in which you are responsible for both the architecture of a space and the sculpture within it. You are not just making objects now, you are making a room that thinks. The architecture of the new sacristy is cool, precise, and slightly unsettling. Where classical architecture tends toward harmony and resolution, yours introduces a subtle tension. Windows that are a little too narrow, niches that press a little too close together. The whole space has the feeling of something held very carefully in check. The figures in the tombs of Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici are among the most mysterious in the entire history of sculpture. On Lorenzo's tomb, Two reclining figures, dawn and dusk. Dawn is a woman waking, eyes barely open, face still soft with sleep, body twisting as consciousness returns. Dusk is a man subsiding into evening, heavy with the weight of a day's exhaustion. They flank the sealed and armoured figure of Lorenzo himself, who sits in an alcove above and gazes across the room towards something unseen with an expression of such profound, abstracted intelligence that visitors assume there must be something remarkable on the opposite wall. And there is. The matching tomb of his nephew Giuliano, flanked by night and day. Night is possibly the most beautiful sleeping figure ever carved. She is a woman curled in the posture of deep sleep, one arm raised above her head, one knee slightly elevated, her body relaxed in the particular way of genuine unconsciousness. Beneath her left foot, an owl. Under her shoulder, a mask of nightmare. At her feet, poppies. She's sleeping, and the viewer feels, watching her, an ambiguous pull, the desire to see her wake, and the terrible sense that it might be better for her if she doesn't. Someone writes a poem about her while you're still working on the sacristy. The poet suggests that perhaps Night is happy to sleep because the world is so full of misery. You respond with a poem of your own, in Night's voice. She says, "Dear to me is sleep, and dearer still to be of stone, while injustice and shame last. Not to see, not to hear, is the greatest blessing. Do not wake me. Do not speak to me. Keep your voice low. You are working on a commission in a family chapel carving memorial figures, and you turn it into a political statement about living in a world where you cannot say what you think. This is quintessential Michelangelo. Nothing is ever just what it appears to be. The new sacristy is never fully completed. You leave Florence in 1534, and the figures of the river gods that were meant to lie at the bases of the tombs are never carved. The room stands today as a fragment of an intended whole, which is arguably more interesting than the completed version would have been. The figures that are there, the 4 times of day, the 2 idealized portraits, the Madonna and Child on the opposite wall, these are enough, more than enough. Visitors to the Medici chapels in Florence stand in the sacristy and feel the weight of the room press against them in a way that no photograph can quite prepare them for. The figures are too large for the space they occupy. The ceiling presses down. The proportions are fractionally wrong in ways that are not mistakes but intentions. A space designed to induce a particular feeling of compression, of time pressing down on the human body, of mortality not as an abstract concept but as a physical environment you are standing inside. You spent years in that room. You carved the times of day. You gave night your voice. You left before you could finish. And Florence has been looking at your abandoned intentions ever since. In 1527, Rome falls. The army of Holy. Roman Emperor Charles V, a chaotic mercenary force, sacks the city in an event of extraordinary violence. The Pope, Clement VII, locks himself in the Castel Sant'Angelo and watches from the battlements as Rome burns below him. The sacking lasts for months. Churches are looted. Nuns are assaulted. Priceless manuscripts are destroyed. The city that was becoming the grandest in Europe is reduced, temporarily, to a ruined thing. Florence uses the opportunity to expel the Medici again. A Republican government takes over. You, a lifelong lover of Florence's Republican traditions and an occasional servant of the Medici, who has always felt the contradiction of this relationship keenly, support the Republic. You are made Governatore e Procuratore Generale delle Fortificazioni, which is a magnificent title, meaning that you are now in charge of designing the military defences of the city. You design fortifications in a way that is immediately recognisable as the work of a sculptor-architect. Angular, overlapping, designed to create interlocking fields of fire that leave no defensive blind spot. The designs are so advanced that military historians in the 20th century noted they anticipate principles that weren't formalised for another century and a half. In 1530, after 11 months of siege, Florence falls to the combined forces of the Pope and the Emperor. The Medici return. The Republic collapses. The men who supported it face various unpleasant consequences. You hide. For several weeks, in the new sacristy of San Lorenzo, while the politics settle. You emerge eventually when it becomes clear that Pope Clement has decided that killing Michelangelo would be bad for his reputation and that the new sacristy's tombs are not going to finish themselves. You go back to work. What else would you do? Chapter 7. Rome again and the Wall of the Dead. In 1534, you leave Florence for the last time. You are 59 years old. You have lived and worked through the fall of the Medici, the rise of Savonarola, the French invasion, the sack of Rome, the siege of Florence, the collapse of the Republic, and the death of roughly half the people you've ever cared about. You do not know, when you board the horse that will carry you down the road toward Rome, that you will never return to the city you love most, but you will live for another 30 years in Rome, and Rome, eventually, will become yours. You have left the new sacristy unfinished. The tomb of Julius II is still unfinished. You have approximately 6 incomplete major projects trailing behind you like a comet's tail. This will be a recurring theme for the rest of your life. Not because you're lazy, which nobody in the history of artistic characterization has ever accused you of being, but because the scope of what you attempt is always larger than what the available years can contain. In Rome, you enter the household of Pope Paul III Farnese, who becomes the dominant patron of your final decades. Paul is not Julius, but he has something Julius had, an absolute conviction that the greatest living artist should be working for him, and the political will to make this happen. He also has considerably better manners. Paul has a project for you. The altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, the enormous wall above the altar, is to be painted with a Last Judgment. You painted the ceiling 20 years ago. Now you will paint the wall. You begin in 1536. You are 61 years old. To make way for the new work, 2 earlier frescoes on the wall, including one of your own from decades before, are destroyed. This is not unusual. Popes do not have a particularly sentimental relationship with the artwork of their predecessors. What matters is the present commission, the present statement of papal power and theological seriousness. The Last Judgment is completed in 1541. It covers approximately 1,800 square feet. The composition shows the moment of Christ's judgment, of souls, the saved rising on the left, the damned descending on the right, with Christ at the centre, his arm raised in a gesture that is simultaneously a welcome and a sentence. He is not the gentle shepherd of standard iconography. He is young, powerful, almost angry, more like an athletic god than a serene saviour. His mother beside him flinches slightly, unable to look directly at what is happening. The choice to make Christ look like this, like a classical hero rather than a Byzantine icon, is deliberate and slightly scandalous. You are 60 years old, and you are still doing things that make the church uncomfortable, and you remain completely unrepentant about it. The Christ you paint is the Christ you believe in, not a mild figure dispensing comfort, but a force of justice, of reckoning, of the kind of love that doesn't flinch from its own severity. The figures swirl around him in a great gravitational spiral, the saints with their instruments of martyrdom, the trumpeting angels, the ascending blessed, the dragging down by demons damned. The whole composition turns like a wheel, pulled by the centripetal force of the judging god at its centre. In the flayed skin held by St. Bartholomew, whose martyrdom was to be skinned alive, you paint a self-portrait. Not your face on one of the triumphant figures, or the saints, or the ascending souls. Your face on the loose, empty skin, the shed husk of a man, looking out at the viewer from the crumpled face of something that has been completely emptied. It is not subtle. It is one of the most brutally honest self-portraits in the history of art, and it required a detailed knowledge of your own face that is, in itself, remarkable. Artists of your period rarely painted recognizable self-portraits. You have painted yours onto a shed skin dangling in the space between heaven and hell, in the hands of a man who was martyred for his faith. The Last Judgment causes immediate controversy, specifically the nudity. The hundreds of figures are painted without significant drapery, which certain church officials find inappropriate for a sacred space. The papal master of ceremonies, Biagio da Cesena, complains loudly that the work is better suited to a public bath than a papal chapel. You paint him into the work. He appears in the lower right corner as Minos, judge of the underworld, his ears wearing the ears of a donkey, a serpent wrapped around him in a way that leaves the implication unambiguous. When he complains to the Pope, Paul III observes that he has no jurisdiction in hell and does nothing. The battle over the nudity continues long after your death. In 1564, shortly after you die, the Church commissions Daniele da Volterra to paint drapery over the most exposed figures. Volterra earns the eternal nickname Il Bragattone, the underpants maker. Some of his additions remain on the wall to this day. Chapter 8. Stone and Bone, Architecture and Love. The final 3 decades of your life are not a slowing down. They are a transformation. The fury that drove the David and the Sistine ceiling does not dissipate. It concentrates, becomes something more complicated and more still. You are appointed chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica in 1546. You are 71 years old. The commission is technically the capstone of a career, but it is also, as almost every major commission in your life has been, a source of anguish. The project has been underway in various forms since Pope Julius commissioned it 4 decades earlier. Bramante designed it. Raphael worked on it. Antonio da Sangallo the Younger spent years on his version of the plans. You take over after Sangallo's death, immediately discard most of what Sangallo has done, and begin restructuring the design from the foundations outward. The architectural world of Rome watches with a mixture of awe and alarm. You are a sculptor. You are a painter. You are not, by training, an architect. And yet your architectural instincts are arguably more sophisticated than those of anyone who is, because you approach architecture the way you approach stone, not as a set of rules to be applied, but as a problem of the relationship between mass and void, between weight and support, between what a structure wants to do and what you will allow it to do. The buildings you design have the same quality as your sculptures, the sense of enormous energy barely held in check, of form that might at any moment burst its own boundaries. Your St. Peter's is organized around the vast dome that you intend to place above the crossing. You design it from principle, not imitation, a double-shell structure, ribbed and coffered, that would be the largest dome in the world when completed. You spend years refining the design, building a large wooden model that still survives, walking around it, adjusting the proportions, the curvature of the shell, the placement of the lantern at the top. You will not live to see the dome built. It will be completed, based on your designs with some modifications, by Giacomo della Porta in 1590, 26 years after your death. But the dome that stands over St. Peter's today, the dome that defines the skyline of Rome, that can be seen from miles away, that every painter has reproduced and every tourist has photographed, is yours. In conception, in proportion, in principle, it is yours. During these years, something happens that changes the interior weather of your life. You meet Vittoria Colonna. Colonna is a poet, a widow, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and deep religious conviction. She is part of a circle of Catholics who are deeply troubled by the corruption within the Church and sympathetic to some of the reforms being proposed by Protestants elsewhere in Europe, though careful to remain within the bounds of Catholic orthodoxy. She is not young when you meet her, neither are you. You are both in your 60s. The world in which you are both operating, the Italy of the 1530s and 1540s, is a world in which the Church is deeply anxious. The Protestant Reformation is tearing through Northern Europe. Luther's ideas are spreading. The Council of Trent is being called to address the crisis. Anyone who expresses even mild sympathy with reform ideas is viewed with suspicion, and Colonna's circle, the Spirituali, walk a very careful line. Some of them will later be suspected of heresy. One of them, Juan de Valdés, is eventually condemned posthumously. Colonna herself dies before any official censure, but the anxious, searching religious atmosphere in which she and her friends move is palpable in the art you make for her and the letters you write to her. What happens between you is not a love affair in any conventional sense. You exchange poems, you exchange drawings, you spend time together, talking about theology, about art, about faith, about death, which is increasingly present in both your lives. She sends you a book of her poetry, signed with her name. You send her drawings, a crucifixion, a Pietà, a Christ at the Garden of Gethsemane. They are among the most tender and spiritually naked things you ever make. Your letters to her are the letters of someone who is in love with a mind. You tell her that she has given you something no one else has, a reason to believe that the love of beauty and the love of God are not in competition, that the art you have spent your life making is not a distraction from the divine, but a path toward it. She dies in February 1547. You are beside her as she passes. You later tell Giorgio Vasari, your biographer and friend, that you regret nothing so much as that when she died. You kissed only her hand, and not her forehead, and not her face. This admission, from a man who has carved the Madonna 100 times, and spent his life at the intersection of body and spirit, is one of the most heartbreaking things in the documentary record of a heartbreaking life. After Colonna's death, you become increasingly absorbed by questions of faith and mortality. You have always been religious, but it has been a complicated, turbulent, argumentative relationship with God, the relationship of two strong personalities who respect each other but disagree on methods. In your final decades, this relationship becomes quieter and more urgent. You write more poetry, increasingly theological in its concerns. You carve 3 more Pietàs, returning to the subject of your great early triumph, but with very different intent. The first of these late Pietàs is the so-called Florentine Pietà, or the Deposition, which you intend for your own tomb. It shows Christ, his body just taken from the cross, supported by Mary Magdalene, the Virgin Mary, and Nicodemus, the Pharisee who came to Christ by night. Nicodemus is traditionally given, in this type of composition, the position of the supporter, the one bearing weight. You give Nicodemus your own face. Again, not the shed skin this time, your actual face, carved at roughly your actual age, supporting the dead body of God. At some point while working on this sculpture, something goes wrong. You are dissatisfied, possibly with the quality of the marble, which has inclusions and flaws that appear as you cut deeper, or with the technical execution of the figure of Christ, whose left leg you have already removed and recarved. You take a hammer to the work, you smash it. Your assistant Tiberio Calcagni eventually repairs it and finishes some of the surfaces, but the central figures remain unfinished, raw in places, the tool marks visible. It is placed in a church in Florence today, incomplete, bearing the marks of its creator's rage. The final Pietà, the Rondanini Pietà, which you are working on in the last days of your life, is something else entirely. The figure of Christ has been carved down so many times, rethought and reapproached, that it has become attenuated beyond realism, a tall, thin shape that seems to be dissolving back into the stone rather than emerging from it. The Virgin behind him merges with his body, barely distinguishable from it, as though the grief of the mother and the death of the son have become the same substance. It does not look like the work of the man who carved the Pietà in St. Peter's. It looks like the work of a man who has followed beauty and power and technical mastery as far as they will go, and has arrived at the end at something much simpler and stranger and more devastated. Chapter 9. The Last Years and the Unfinished Chisel. By his 80s, Michelangelo is the most famous artist alive. This is not an exaggeration. There is no close second. He is described by contemporaries as divine, a word they use with varying degrees of hyperbole, but which, in his case, seems to reach for something genuinely beyond the normal vocabulary of admiration. Giorgio Vasari, who is writing the lives of the artists during these years, and who knows him personally, and has access to him in a way no subsequent biographer will, simply calls him Il Divino, the Divine One. Vasari's Lives, published first in 1550 and then in an expanded edition in 1568, places Michelangelo at the culmination of the entire history of art, the apex toward which Giotto and Cimabue and Ghiberti and Donatello and Brunelleschi were all building, the perfect artist in whom all the qualities of the Renaissance are realized and transcended simultaneously. This is a remarkable claim. It is also, by the judgment of almost everyone who has looked seriously at the evidence, essentially correct. He is also, by any reasonable standard, a very difficult person to know. He has always been difficult. The servants who work for him in these years leave accounts of a man who eats almost nothing, who sleeps badly and briefly, who wears his boots to bed sometimes for days at a stretch, and who, when he finally removes them, occasionally takes the skin of his legs off with them because the leather has adhered. He smells. He is suspicious of everyone. He is generous with money in unpredictable bursts and then clinches it tight for months. He writes letters to his family in Florence, his nephews and grandnephews, full of practical advice and financial instructions, and an anxious love that has no adequate outlet in physical presence. He has no children. He is never married. The family he has is the family he was born into, and they are far away. People who come to visit him during these last years sometimes describe a kind of shock. They have expected the divine Michelangelo, some august and commanding figure, and they find instead an old man in rough working clothes, his hands perpetually calloused and marked with stone dust, who talks rapidly and precisely about his current work, and then wants to know about theirs. He has opinions about every architect in Rome. He has opinions about the young painters he sees working. He dispenses these opinions freely and without diplomatic consideration, which makes him both an extraordinary teacher and a socially dangerous dinner guest. He has one great friend in these years, the young Roman nobleman Tommaso de Cavalieri. You meet Cavalieri when you are 57 and he is around 23. The relationship is intense, documented in letters and poems that are extraordinary in their emotional transparency. You write to him that you have never loved any man more than you love him. You send him drawings, Ganymede being carried to heaven by the eagle, Phaethon falling from the chariot of the sun, Titius chained to the rock having his liver perpetually eaten. The drawings are mythological scenes, but the choices are not random. Ganymede is the boy taken up by the king of the gods. Phaethon is the one who flew too close to the sun and was destroyed for his ambition. Titius is in eternal torment for his love of a goddess. You are writing your own emotional autobiography in Greek myth. These drawings for Cavalieri represent a strange and moving category of artistic production. They are not commissions. They are gifts made out of love, or whatever the complex thing you feel for this young man actually is. They are among the most technically accomplished drawings of the Renaissance. They are also unmistakably personal, not in the way of a diary or a confession, but in the way of a person who uses art as the most honest language available to them, because the alternative languages are less adequate to the things they feel. You are, by this point in your life, a man who has experienced love in many forms, and found adequate expression for it in very few. Your devotion to Florence, your love for the men and women who have shaped your life, your tortured, reverential relationship with God, your fierce and complicated attachment to your family, which expresses itself almost entirely in money and advice, because the emotional vocabulary is one you have largely channeled into marble and fresco. Into Cavalieri you pour something that has nowhere else to go, a fullness of feeling for another human being that you have not permitted yourself, perhaps, since the years in the Medici Palace when you were young enough to simply feel things without interrogating them first. Cavalieri stays loyal. He is with you in the last years a constant presence, a man who has grown from the young nobleman who received your extraordinary drawings into a middle-aged friend who makes sure you have food and that someone comes to check on you in the mornings. The relationship is one of the subjects most keenly debated by art historians who argue in exhaustive detail about what it was and was not, what the letters mean and don't mean, and whether the poems are homoerotic or spiritual or both. What is not debated is its reality. You loved Tommaso de Cavalieri. He loved you in return, in whatever form that love took. He is there at the end. You live in Rome in a modest house near the Trajan Column. By the standards of your fame and of what you are paid, the house is almost incongruously plain. You don't spend money on yourself. You give it away to poor people, to artists in need, to the church, to your family. You dress in rough, practical clothes. You eat bread and wine and dried fish, and occasionally forget to eat at all. You are in your late 80s and you are still working every day. Visitors who come to see you in these last years often describe a version of you that is still formidable, still sharp, still fully present. But there are also accounts of fatigue, of a man who is carrying a weight too large for any body to hold indefinitely. You are tired of starting things you can't finish. The dome of St. Peter's is designed but not built. The Rondanini Pietà is not finished and will not be. The tomb of Julius is finally done but is not what you promised. There is a long list of the unfinished, and it trails behind you everywhere. On the 12th of February 1564, you work all day on the Rondanini Pietà. You are 88 years old. You have been working on this sculpture in various forms for perhaps 9 years. You stand at the stone with your chisel and you work. The figure has been rethought so many times that a detached arm, an earlier version of Christ's right arm, hangs at the side of the block, never fully removed, a ghost of an abandoned intention. The current version of Christ and the Virgin are barely distinguishable from one another. Their bodies merging in the stone, and the surface is rough, unfinished in the way of a work in progress, not the polished marble of the Pietà in St. Peter's, but something rawer and more honest. It is not trying to be beautiful in the way the early Pietà was beautiful. It is trying to be true. The next day you have a fever. You sit by the fire. You tell those around you that you regret that you are dying, just as you was beginning to understand the alphabet of my profession. This is the most Michelangelo thing it is possible to say. On the 18th of February 1564, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni dies. He is 88 years old. He has outlived his father, his mother, his 4 brothers, 3 popes who were his employers, most of his friends, and the entire artistic culture of the early Renaissance that gave him birth. He has produced a body of work that, measured by quality and by influence, has no equivalent in the history of human creativity. He is attended at the death by Tommaso de Cavalieri, who has known him for 31 years. He is attended by his doctor, his servant, and 1 or 2 others. He dies quietly. The great noise of his life, all the fury and the stone dust and the paint dripping into his eyes, and the arguments with popes and the knights on scaffolding with aching shoulders, and the unfinished tombs and the shed skin of St. Bartholomew, and the fingers almost touching in the ceiling vault above, all of it subsides into an ordinary room, an ordinary evening, a man letting go. 4 days later, Giorgio Vasari writes a letter to describe the death to his friends. He says that nature, which had fashioned Michelangelo perfectly as a model for what art could be, now mourns the loss of the one man who had demonstrated to the world what art, in perfection, could do. This is not ordinary grief talking. Vasari spent his career as a painter in conscious tribute to Michelangelo. He built his reputation on being close to the greatest artist alive. But the grief in the letter is real, because everyone who had come close to Michelangelo understood, in the way you understand the presence of something irreplaceable, that the world had been larger and stranger and more alive with him in it. Chapter 10. What he left behind. The body is prepared in Rome and then, in secret, smuggled out of the city in a bale of cloth on a horse's back, because his nephew Leonardo has come from Florence to collect him, and the Romans would certainly have tried to keep him. Even dead, Michelangelo is too valuable to release without argument. Florence claims him. Florence has always claimed him, even in the long decades when he wasn't there. He belongs to the city the way that David belongs to it, which is to say, absolutely, mythologically, and in a way that transcends any individual person's consent. He is buried in the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, the same church that contains the tombs of Galileo and Machiavelli, and Dante's cenotaph. The tomb is designed by Giorgio Vasari. 3 female figures represent the arts of painting, sculpture, and architecture, all weeping. The bust above them looks out with the expression of someone who is absolutely exhausted and absolutely undefeated. What does he leave behind? Let us count, briefly, incompletely, because the full accounting is impossible. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is still there. The Last Judgment is still there. The Pietà is still in St. Peter's. The David is in the Accademia. The Moses, from the simplified final version of Julius's tomb, sits in the church of San Pietro in Vincoli, and tourists go there specifically and stand in front of it, and it makes them feel something they cannot quite articulate. The new sacristy, with its dawn and dusk and night and day and the sleeping knight who asked not to be woken, is still in Florence. The Rondanini Pietà is in Milan, unfinished and more honest for it. The Bacchus is in the Bargello in Florence, still slightly drunk, still grinning. The drawings, hundreds of them, are in museums across the world, and they are extraordinary in their own right, quick studies and finished presentation pieces that reveal the thinking behind the making. He wrote nearly 300 poems. They have been translated into every major language. They are not occasional verses dashed off between sculptures. They are poems by someone who took language as seriously as stone. Someone who understood that the impulse behind art and the impulse behind poetry are the same impulse, the desire to make a form that contains more than its surface suggests. The dome of St. Peter's, completed after his death, defines the skyline of Rome, and therefore, in the history of Western architecture, defines a great deal more than that. Every dome built in the 2 centuries after it, in Europe and in the Americas, is a conversation with Michelangelo's dome. The Capitol building in Washington, D.C. is part of that conversation. St. Paul's Cathedral in London is part of that conversation. The dome of the Pantheon in Paris, the dome of the Invalides. Everywhere you look, in the civic and religious architecture of the Western world, you are looking at consequences of a dome designed by a 71-year-old sculptor who had never formally studied architecture. The influence is not a matter of historical record only. It is visible. It is present. You can walk into a room with a painting or a building influenced by Michelangelo and feel it, a certain scale, a certain weight, a certain relationship between human beings and the space they occupy that is recognizable as his in the way a musical phrase is recognizable as the work of its composer. He gave the body back to Western art. He showed that the human form, in all its musculature and tension and aspiration and grief, was the most adequate symbol available for every spiritual and emotional truth that needed to be expressed. This was not a new idea. The ancient Greeks had it, but it had been lost or muffled for 1,000 years. He found it again, and he handed it back to the world in marble and fresco, and the world has been using it ever since. Consider what happened after him. The generation of Mannerist artists who immediately followed him stretched his muscular figures into increasingly elongated, twisted, intellectually complex forms, trying to take his energy further. Then Baroque artists like Bernini took his theatrical sense of captured motion and built an entirely new vocabulary of religious art from it. The Romantics of the 19th century worshipped him as the archetypal tormented genius, misreading his suffering as inspiration rather than understanding that the suffering and the greatness were not connected in the way they wanted to believe. And in the 20th century, every serious discussion of the relationship between art and the body, between craft and meaning, between the spiritual and the physical, has had to reckon with the standard he set. He was not an easy person. He was suspicious, sometimes cruel in his assessments of other artists, financially anxious to a degree that embarrassed people who knew how much he earned, incapable of working within what anyone else considered a reasonable time frame, and apparently impossible to live with on any extended basis. He also wrote poetry of considerable quality. He was deeply capable of love, even if he rarely expressed it in ways his contemporaries found legible. He was funny in the dry, caustic way of people who have seen too much to pretend that most situations are not fundamentally absurd. He worked until 6 days before he died. He apologized at the end for not having done enough. This is the record of the divine Michelangelo, a man who looked at blank walls and blank marble and blank vaults and could not leave them alone, who spent 88 years in argument with the material world, trying to pull out of it something that matched what he saw inside his own head, who succeeded more often and more completely than any other artist who has ever lived. The stone is still there. The figures are still emerging from it. He just isn't holding the chisel anymore. But in a sense that matters more than biography, he never stopped. The work goes on without him. The ceiling breathes without him. The David stands without him. And 5 centuries from now, someone will walk into a room and look up and feel something they did not expect to feel, and Michelangelo will have done it again. Epilogue. what we carry forward. There is a reason people still line up 5 centuries later to stand beneath the Sistine ceiling and tip their heads back until their necks ache. It is not purely out of cultural obligation, not simply because someone told them this is something worth seeing. It is because whatever Michelangelo found in himself and pressed into marble and plaster is still there, still radiating, still speaking to whatever part of a human being recognizes beauty as a form of truth. He painted a god reaching toward a man with one outstretched finger, and the gap between those 2 fingers became the most famous image in the history of Western art, because it is the perfect image of what it is to be human, to be almost touched, to be close enough to something transcendent that you can feel the warmth of it, and to exist permanently in the space between reaching and arriving. That image has appeared on coffee mugs and t-shirts and in cartoons and in parodies and in political campaigns. It has been reproduced more times than anyone has counted, and somehow, impossibly, none of that reproduction has diminished it. You can walk into the Sistine Chapel having seen that image 1,000 times and look up at it in its original context, surrounded by the full sweep of the ceiling in the building it was made for, and it still does what it was made to do. It still reaches for you across the centuries and nearly touches. He carved a David who stands in the moment before the terrible thing, and the statue has moved people for 500 years. Because all of us live in that moment, the moment before we have to do the thing we are afraid to do, and seeing someone else in that moment, carved in marble, 18 feet tall and still choosing to go forward, gives us something we can use. He carved night and asked her to stay sleeping because the world was too painful for waking, and he spoke for everyone who has ever wanted to close their eyes against a reality that has stopped making sense. He signed his name on the strap of the Virgin's dress in the middle of the night, because he could not bear for the greatest thing he had made to be attributed to someone else, and that small, human, desperate act of vanity makes him more present and more real than all the divine mythology that surrounds him. Think about what it actually means to look at the work he left. When you stand in front of the Pietà in St. Peter's, you are standing in front of an object made by a man who was 23 years old when he made it, who had spent his childhood in a stonecutter's village, who had no formal education beyond a grammar school he barely attended, and an apprenticeship he abandoned after 1 year. He made this thing with his hands, with chisels and abrasives, and an understanding of marble that he developed by studying ancient objects in a garden, and by dissecting human bodies in a hospital basement. And the result is something that stops people in their tracks 500 years later and makes them feel in the middle of a tourist-crowded basilica in Rome, something they were not expecting to feel when they woke up that morning. This is the achievement. Not the technique, though the technique is miraculous. Not the scale, though the scale is overwhelming. The achievement is that the things he made continue to do something to people. They continue to communicate across the enormous distance of centuries and languages and cultures. Something true about what it is to be alive and to love and to grieve and to be afraid and to go forward anyway. He was a man. He was made of the same things you are made of. Hunger and love and pride and fear and the absolute refusal, right up to the end, to stop trying. The marble was already perfect, he believed. His job was simply to remove everything that wasn't the figure, to cut away until what was always there could finally be seen. He spent 88 years cutting away, and what he left we are still looking at. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight. If this story moved you, hit that like button and consider subscribing so you never miss a new video. Drop a comment telling me who you'd like to explore next. And remember, somewhere right now there is a piece of marble with a figure inside it, waiting for someone with enough patience and enough courage to set it free. Until next time, keep the lights a little lower and let history breathe.